So I caught up with Liam this morning, who's an EMN manage, and he basically said that we probably should just like pick a feature and do the first step towards merging groups and projects, because there's a lot of opinions, but we just like need someone to be a DRI for making the decision on how we're gonna like approach it. And so I wanted to talk with y'all. I think from my vantage point, the biggest thing that we would need for our stage, like the long-term vision, is to make issues available at the group level. Because then once we introduce types of issues and all that good stuff, it unblocks requirements being at the group level. It unblocks eventually migrating epics to types of issues. And so I was just curious if, Jan, you said you would be willing to maybe like drive the blueprint forward, or at least could get us to a point where we know how to take the first small step of getting issues at the group level without like duplicating them from a model standpoint. So
just a second. So this one issue is about consolidating projects and groups, or yeah. So I left an idea about consolidation in the merge request blueprint. I will paste to the doc. It's a little bit unfortunate that that discussion is happening on two places.
That's just the issue is that merge request resolves the issue, if that makes sense. So we can talk in just the merge request if you want, but like the issue is in the architecture project about opening up or like creating a blueprint, and then the merge request that you commented on is the merge request that will close that issue. So if that makes sense.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so I agree with the idea of consolidating projects and groups. And I think that other engineers too. The only tricky part is how to actually achieve this, because there is no clear migration path at this moment, and I'm not sure if we can do this without too much code duplication or duplicating implementation of resources both on projects and groups. So I quite like the idea of project shadowing, where the idea is that we would basically deprecate groups in favor of projects, and to make this iteratively, we could create a shadow or hidden project for each group and start migrating resources from the group to the shadowed project. And once all features or resources are migrated to this shadow project, so basically group would be just an empty wrapper around this shadow project. We could just expose this project instead of the group. So that's one of the ideas how to make this consolidation. But at this point, I left the comment there a week ago, and I think that before diving deeper or investigating this idea deeper, I would appreciate some feedback from some architects or other engineers, what is either a problem with this approach, or if there is something else, some other way we should focus. Because otherwise it might be just waste of idea to trying to create a detailed plan which elaborates on top of this idea.
Yeah, I think it's I would like to get feedback from other folks too. I think basically Alex is working on rapid action stuff and is not thinking about this, and I just am worried that it's going to sit here for months and nothing will happen because it's a hard problem to solve. And so I just appreciate if any of the engineers in our stage wanted to contribute towards that, to figuring out the solution. That would be awesome. Because I know that there are lots of other teams that want to contribute. They just don't know, sort of like they don't know how to, because there's not like a good direction page for them to kind of take to figure out how to like implement their features in a similar type pattern. So if we can lay the groundwork basically for how to do that with our own features, I think it would be really beneficial for the entire product and the rest of the team. So
yeah, so I think that you touched this because of how we would get epics on project level and issues on group level, and I think that this is closely related because I forgot to mention it. The point is that if we deprecate groups in favor and we replace it with projects, we basically get both for free, yeah, because group would be replaced by project, yeah. So we wouldn't have to implement epics on project level now or issues on group level now. But if we focus on deprecating groups or projects or just one of these containers, we get this for free. Yeah. And
This also means that we first need to bring all of the group features to the project, right? Even before creating the shadowing project itself, we just need to bring everything in the project to have everything there in order to be able then to create this shadowing project that will kind of replace the group. Do I get it right?
No, I thought that we would create the shadowing project first, and then we would start iteratively migrating the features from the group level to this shadowed project.
Okay, so then we will kind of need to tweak APIs and whatever services we have to kind of accept both a group ID and a project ID and stuff like that to be able to.
No. On API layer, you would still you would still reference group, yeah, but internally the group would just delegate this feature request to the shadowed project. Yeah, so it would be internal delegation to the shadowed project.
So then before we can deprecate the group, then we'll need to move stuff to the project in the meantime. Got it.
Yeah.
And make the inheritance model work. Like, because I know right now Manage is working on some like a proof of concept, basically to have cascading settings and from instance to a namespace, but it's not implemented. Like they haven't implemented it from like a namespace to a subgroup, and then from a subgroup to a project. And so this is sort of like why understanding how this will work will also help everyone else understand like when to move forward, like doing something that will not be necessary, hopefully in the near future, or at least contribute to like moving it forward.
So it would be great to get. I think what I was waiting personally is the feedback, which I mentioned before. I would need some agreement from distinguished engineers or architects. Okay, this makes sense. Please proceed, or we can focus on this, and then we can work in working group to trying to figuring out detailed steps. Or there may be a pushback from architects. Okay, this will not work, and we should figure out some other way. Yeah, but so I don't have this feedback yet, so I think that for me, or waiting point for me was getting this feedback basically. So
cool.
If there is someone specific I should ping, I pinged people on the merge request, but yeah, I don't know.
All right, I'll go start pinging a bunch of people too, and just seeing if like we can get some feedback on it. I would hope DZ would have responded by now, but he hasn't. But I'll add a comment to that and see if we can get somebody to give us some more feedback. Cool. Thank you.
Cool. I could talk about some roadmap stuff. Let me share my screen. I'm sharing the right screen. Cool. So Kushal and I have been looking at roadmaps and specifically kind of like the date picking experience, which we don't have at the moment, and what that could look like. It ended up being a little more complicated, and thanks for bearing with me here, Kushal. But yeah, so instead of having like a traditional date picker where you could pick any range, I'm thinking for MVC, we just add kind of like a default date picker into the roadmap with a few kind of sane defaults. Like let's say this quarter, this year, within 3 years, which I'm thinking could be like from today back a year and a half and forward a year and a half, something like that. And what I like about these kind of set defaults is then we could control what's presented on the roadmap and like what kind of empty states, let's say, might appear. So for example, when I looked into this, I'll kind of take y'all through my process. I thought about like what dates might make sense and what that means for our current roadmap and how we display data. Because we have these kind of fixed columns, it can get a little unwieldy if you have, for example, short timeframes. So I kind of mapped out, thinking about the different timeframes by the view or like how you would be segmenting them. So let's say I'm looking at months. I want to look at a month by quarters, or I want to look at a month by a month. I want to look at a month by week. Like, so what could that look like for all these timeframes? And this is where it got kind of wacky, which is what we discovered while we were trying to look at this and thinking about building it. And especially for any time frame ever, you run into all these weird kind of empty states because our columns are set by that segment. So if I'm looking at month by quarter on my screen, I'm only seeing basically one column of data. So this whole block is basically like a like a screen resolution of like 1920. And then this would be like a more like 1360 or 1320, something like here. So even if you have not an ultra wide monitor, you'd still only be seeing one column of data here. So it's kind of like, what is this empty state, right? And then thinking about that across all those different segments I mentioned, there's just a lot of empty data states in here, which might not be terrible. Could look something like this, right? And maybe we just don't have the drop shadow here because you can't scroll. And then there's just kind of like grayed out time frame up here. I'm not sure, like, is that super useful? I don't really think so. And once you zoom out this time frame, it gets so long that you're perhaps having to scroll a whole lot just to see maybe one epic that's just like way at the end here. So I'm thinking for iteration 1, we could just kind of like scope it down to a few different time frames that don't have those weird empty states I just showed. And I don't think that it would be too much of a different experience than we have now, but it could be a step forward to something better. So I picked out the states that we have currently that don't have that empty state on them. And that would be, I believe, these 6 here. So if we look at the picker, it would look something like this. So when I selected this quarter, I would only be able to view it by weeks. So I wouldn't even have like that little segmenting experience for the different views. If I select this year, I could select by viewing that by months or by weeks. If I select within 3 years, I could see quarters, months, and weeks like it is currently. And then within the roadmap, it would look something like this. So not too different. For iteration 2, which I have here, yeah, I attached it. I'm thinking it might be interesting to make those column widths more dynamic. So I'm kind of like zooming into the roadmap based on how I'm setting my dates. So instead of having the column widths always set like this, when I select a time frame, it kind of zooms me in. So for example, you could see it kind of side by side in the issue, but I'll just show you here. So I would see something like this, for example. So I want to see my quarter segmented by quarter. I see this instead of this, which has, you know, a bunch of, has an empty state. Or if I want to see, what's a better one? Month segmented by week. Half my screen would be an empty state here. If I see month segmented by week here, you know, it could take up my entire viewport, which would be nice. And maybe we could play around with even like, do we even need them to scroll you know, left and right? Or can we just have this be fixed in the viewport like this? I don't know. That could be something to think about. But it's an easier way to see the data. So this is something not MVC, but I think it'd be nice to explore here. And we can even get, you know, fancy with the brush and zoom control, things like that. But, you know, as you see here, like I could see in my viewport an entire 3 years of data segmented by week. And it looks a little weird. I don't know if you want to do that. You can. And that's a lot more usable than having to scroll, you know, a million times to view all those epics. And then the intention here is that we can make the roadmap more performant as well. And, you know, I think that this is not going to solve the performance problem. I think what we need to do is start by giving the user like narrow data and letting them broaden it instead of starting broad and letting them narrow. So maybe even like templates or making them pick a group to start, or, you know, who knows, don't get scared. Those are just ideas, but like letting them filter first, I think could be good. But this could be a step in the right direction. And I also think this would be more useful to use and view on your roadmap. So, all right, I threw a lot at y'all. What do you think?
I think for the MVC, if you set a date range of whatever it is, don't have the little picker next to it to let them specify the date or the week or month or whatever, just automatically change the chart to, or the roadmap to reflect that, if that makes sense. Because that way, like, it would declutter things, and it's almost like giving them the option to toggle between months and weeks is something that you could add later, is like an enhancement, but you could just default to, like, you know, when the date range is this year, you're always going to show things in months. When the date range is 3 years, you're always going to show things in quarters. And that's like it for right now. And then later you can explore like the zooming option that would be something a little bit like more global. But that's my feedback on the picker itself. On the general idea of adding a date range, I don't understand why, other than for performance. Is there a reason that we want to do this other than performance, I guess, is the question.
I think it's just, you can kind of zoom into the dates you care about, right? Rather than endless scrolling. And then I think it gets more useful, like I said, if you add in the idea of kind of like zooming into those dates as well. Like right now it is kind of weird because it doesn't really dynamically change your roadmap except for the performance issues. It could mitigate that a little bit, but even at GitLab, we have so many epics within the year that maybe that wouldn't even help too much, but it could be a step in the right direction, if that makes sense. And then, like I said, like just seeing the view you care about, like configuring that view. But I think that's one of the jobs to be done, is like crafting the view you care about. And then maybe if we get into like saving views, things like that, just kind of having that snapshot, that time frame of you know, what you want to focus on, I think is helpful. And then the segmenting thing, I agree, like we could default. I have seen in other products that like they default the time frame to like 3 years or 4 years and have these segmenting options. But I think both are going to be useful at some point. They're just not super useful at the moment. But I don't know. I mean, like as a PM, Kristen, Gabe, Mark, if you're here, I think you are, like, what would be useful to you in narrowing down a time frame?
I don't want to narrow down a time frame. I want to narrow down like what I see on like the actual epics list, and I want it to be really, really fast, right? Like that's where it's save filters. There's an ongoing open discussion right now where I think Amelia, the designer and monitor, is like exploring some ideas for save filters, but that would be way more valuable for me because then every time I go to the Epic board or the roadmap view, I don't have to go from a bookmark in my browser. I basically can just go and like toggle on my group or the stage as a whole and switch between those like labeled segments, if that makes sense. That would be more valuable to me.
And then
Yeah,
if you, no, go ahead.
Yes, sorry, go ahead, Kristen, go ahead.
I would say for me as well, seeing the whole thing is really important. Like I wouldn't be segmenting my dates as when I'm for getting there, but I would potentially hit that the 3-year or zoom to fit in. So it, like maybe if I'd misplaced something and it was like way out in 2030, the whole thing could zoom and I'd see the whole picture so I could go make adjustments. But I wouldn't be hitting it with the mindset of like, I'm going to set a date range and then look at this. I'd more so see the whole thing, then adjust the zoom level or this where it was centered to find the quarter I'm currently on. But I'd just be afraid I wouldn't see something if it were off, if I'd accidentally queried it out with the date range.
I was going to say for me, I kind of agree. I don't think I want to filter by dates. What I'd rather filter on is by epics or by like removing vertically what's shown and zooming in on like a specific epic or a specific handful of epics or a parent epic with multiple child epics and being able to see how that's progressing. Because one of the things that's really hard to do right now for me is I have organized all the epics for like certify by like category maturity stages. And then I want to know, hey, when will this category maturity stage be complete? And underneath that, it might be like 10 other epics, which each have other sub epics. So it would be nice to be able to like zoom in that way, like filter out what's being shown. So I can say, okay, this epic is the long pull. Let's look at it. Let's plan it out. Let's understand why it's sticking out so far. That type of work is, I think, very relevant to a PM or a project manager type role.
I was also going to add to like, I want to eventually, I hope we eventually merge the idea of a fixed date and an inherited date into one, so that on a board, I can like drag and drop an epic into like a date range and then see like what all the things within it like are planned. If the plan basically over time, if it lines up with my fixed date that I've set, if the inherited date is basically on track for that fixed date. So like, you can actually track the drift between the two. But if we filter our scope to a specific date range, when I'm dragging and dropping the epic dates on a roadmap, like I would be restricted to that date range, which I don't know if I would necessarily like. That's just like another thing to think about for the future. But
If y'all were to, so if we kind of like even just kind of hid the date picker, right? And, you know, for users that really, really, really wanted to get more broad, let's say, right? Like, so many products I saw default to around 4 years. I mean, what would you think the default would be for you? Like, what would be useful to see if we kind of were more, if we had a stance on how long the roadmap is? What would that time frame be?
10 years would be accessible potentially, but probably 5 if I need to zoom out and see longer term vision. We don't go that far yet at GitLab, but a lot of companies do. And then the day-to-day would be segmented by release, probably like so at a 4-week marker and showing around 6 months worth, just to see high level like where things are in terms of the upcoming releases. That would be my guess. I couldn't say exactly. Either by quarter or by release would be the toggle. And I would probably only zoom to week if it were real specific, but we only really track into releases in terms of dates. So it's not like we're looking like it has to be done by Wednesday. We're not like going to that day granularity at GitLab, but some of our customers are probably doing that.
Cool.
I have several thoughts around the design and specifically in the implementation part of it. So right now, when we look at roadmap, I think the fundamental problem we are trying to solve is performance, because that is immediately affecting us, the load times as well as the general interaction times. And there are a couple of reasons why performance is slow, barring the backend, because we are trying to pull in a lot of data in one go. So that is obviously going to slow down our initial request for fetching the epics. As far as front end performance is concerned, the main reason performance slows down is because we are trying to render a lot of things at once, which means that our horizontal timeline, which is not even part of the viewport, is extending beyond the viewport. And we are trying to render a lot of nodes there, and that slows down. And vertically as well, there are too many epics that we render at the same time, even if user is not going to see those epics by scrolling all the way to the bottom of the list. There are some libraries that we did try to utilize in the past, like implement some form of buffered rendering, where user would see only 20 epics. Then only 20 epics are actually rendered. The rest of the epics live within the JavaScript object. So the rendering doesn't take a hit, and interaction is smoother. But as we added new features like milestone lines within the roadmap, it kind of broke the behavior of buffered rendering, because the library was not compatible with the UX that we have around the roadmap. So today, one key behavior that you notice within roadmap is that the horizontal bars where we show the timeline, that is months, which month it is, which quarter it is, which week it is, those are horizontally scrolled when you horizontally scroll the timeline. But when you scroll the list vertically, you see that the headers remain affixed there. And that's via a CSS behavior. Same thing happens with the first column where we show epic details, where when you scroll the list vertically, details rows will be scrolling along with the timeline bars. But when you scroll horizontally, first column remains affixed there. And that is the very initial behavior that we started with when we created roadmap. But when we think about zoom in, zoom out features, Donald and I had a very detailed conversation around how a typical zoom in, zoom out behavior needs to be in our one-on-one. And the analogy that we thought of was, think of Google Maps or any Maps app, where when you zoom out all the way out from the map, you don't want to see the city names or even the county names on the map. If you really zoom out from the map, all you see is the state names if you're looking at a particular country. And if you zoom out further, you see country names and not even state names or city names. So I like to think of zooming functionality to match with that behavior, and to correlate it with how roadmap would work. If user wants to see a time frame of say 5 years or 10 years, chances are that they are interested in epics which span across that timeline, right? And they are not interested in breaking down those epics into say weeks view. So if we do implicit view switching by determining on how long the time frame is. So for instance, if user selects say 5 years, we don't show a preset switcher on UI at all. Rather, we show years as columns, because user knows that these epics are spanning across years, which is why they selected 5 years in first place. And that will solve our performance problem, where we don't render the entire horizontal timeline for the viewport, extended viewport essentially. Instead, we would just render 5 columns and be done with it. If user wants to zoom in further down to reduce the time frame, say for instance, they want to see data of only 3 months, then chances are that they are interested in weeks view or say months view. And depending on what view they want to see, we show either a preset feature, or we again not show preset feature at all. Like if the time frame they have selected is really narrow, we show only weeks view, because they might be interested in exact days on which epic start and epic ends. And if they say select 1 year as a range, we show all the 12 months or a quarter of a year as a preset. So we don't let user determine what preset they use, because we might end up in a similar situation that we have now, where we are rendering too much of items or nodes within the DOM at once. Instead, we be opinionated depending on what the time frame is. This will not only free our filtering area on UI, where we don't show a lot of knobs and buttons. Instead, we just have a filtering search bar where user want to filter by labels or say epic name, etc. And we just show a drop down where user can specify start and due dates. and we determine which view to use, whether it is weeks, months, quarters, or years, depending on the gap between start and due date that user has selected. And once we look at this behavior in production, then we determine whether we are ready to show plus and minus buttons at the corner of the view to show as a zoom in, zoom out feature. This will help our implementation be much performant compared to what it is now, because we get rid of horizontal scroll bar entirely. User will not be able to scroll horizontally at all. They will be able to see the data only for the time frame that they have selected. Only scrolling that will be possible from this behavior is vertical scrolling. And then we can use buffer rendering libraries where we show only number of epics that are visible. Because the reason why we had to revert our code where we initially had the buffer rendering in place was because our timeline was scrolling in both the directions. And particularly horizontal infinite scrolling was the culprit there. So if we get rid of horizontal scrolling entirely, then we might be able to re-implement the usage of that library. And then even if there are 2000 epics in say 10 years of time frame that user has selected, we won't be bothered about performance there. So that's just my thought process on the history behind the implementation and what we can do going forward.
Would this help then, in your opinion, or do we want to be? I mean, like this could be post MVC, and then like we like be opinionated and just like show like 3 views for MVC. Is that kind of what you're thinking, Kushal? So like, so in my thinking, this would be the viewport, and they wouldn't necessarily have to scroll horizontally, like you were talking.
Yeah.
And yeah, so and then we could have the defaults. I don't think I've seen many products that don't allow users to zoom, and that would be my only worry, right? But I'm not like opposed to doing that for MVC, just like having those defaults, and then like you said, adding it in another iteration.
We are not taking away zooming functionality at all. We are still keeping it as it is. We are just taking away the presets. So for instance, if we still continue to show preset, and if user selects say start and due date, which fall within the same month, it doesn't make sense to have presets in first place, because they select the date and they try to fiddle around like what happens if they select month view, while the time frame itself is only a month long, right? So if they zoom in down to the last week, then in that case we don't show preset, we just render weeks view for that time frame. And depending on whatever and we can still have some form of validations in place, like how big of a gap between time frame is, or how small gap there can be. And that way it makes implementation much straightforward without having to deal with a lot of conditions and edge cases.
I think that makes sense.
And just
Oh,
go ahead, Gabe.
Everyone's talking. Go ahead.
I was just going to show this is how I get a lot of customers or that I've talked to that have used RoadMonk that like it or are using it. And this is how they don't support horizontal scrolling, but they let you like basically drag your time range, and that will change like the columns that are shown. So you can zoom in and zoom out this way. And they only ever like segment things by month. But this is sort of how you can go out to, I guess in here, you can only go out 3 years or 2 years or something. We could extend that, but it's a kind of a nice way if you want to solve this problem too, because it more or less does the scrolling for you based on your little slider up here. But you can kind of scope things down to as granular like time frame as you want, and then kind of like move that around if you want to like explore stuff further out. Anyway, it's just thought I'd share that because it's an interesting way to solve the problem too.
Yeah, I think like
Yes. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Alex.
Well, I'm just saying, I think that was what I was envisioning for the MVC2 I was showing. And like, instead of having that brush and zoom, I was seeing the like the little segmenting controls, but maybe we just go with like that kind of control instead, where you're like literally zooming in and out. And I think to your point, Gabe, you said they're only showing months. So I think Kushal, that's kind of what you were saying,
So
more opinionated.
Yeah, so exactly. Like we already have implemented views in place for quarters and weeks view. So the behavior would be similar to what Gabe showed, just that when user really expands the timeline to cover multiple years, we just switch the views instead of shrinking the columns to really smaller width columns, right? Because then we can avoid the problems of empty cells, like you mentioned initially, Alexis, where user may have epics falling within just 1 or 2 quarters, but they are still trying to view 5 years of data, where all the rest of the columns are not being utilized. And that doesn't really make sense unless we introduce a feature where they can just drag and drop the timeline bars to update the range. But yeah, we start with the initial design like this, where we switch between the views. And then when we are ready to implement drag and drop functionality where user can expand and collapse due dates based on just dragging the timeline bars, then we can maybe switch to a single type of view, either weeks or months. But I think implicit view switching where we have 3 different views, and if we do decide to go ahead with the 4th view, that is the years view, in case we want to cover 5 years or 10 years of time frame, then it will be our USP instead of comparing it with a competition product where they are just showing months as a way to drill down the data.
I'm going to
So
just jump into, and oh, sorry, go ahead, Alexis.
No, go ahead.
So I think this looks really cool. I want to make sure that we do hit the use cases for people who are also editing roadmaps. I know right now we're really focusing on getting the zoom right and getting the objects in, and maybe like a static consumption of it. But keep in the back of your mind that this also needs to be an editing environment. I did mention in like point 2, just to consider looking at how Notion has handled that and sort of almost building it into a grid-like experience. I can just quickly share my screen here, where you can easily work on your timeline as well as zoom to it or jump to it using these. It's pretty lightweight. Editing is very different than consuming when you're getting in there and trying to be very specific on your different issues. So just keep that in mind for long-term vision, that the editing is going to be more important as we have more users that are doing top-down planning.
I think that this design looks really great. Thanks, Alexis. As mentioned before, on backend side, the performance will always depend on how many epics frontend asks for. I think I mentioned it in some comment, but it might be that even for the 3 years window, if you request for 4 quarters, it might be still quite a big time frame. So we would still require quite many epics. So I think that it still might not scale very well, but I think that it will improve the situation compared to the current state. So it's worth to try it. But I wanted to ask, did we consider also vertical pagination? Like frontend would ask only for first 10 epics which are being displayed on the roadmap, and these which are not displayed because they are not in the view. I mean vertically, not horizontally. This might be loaded in a separate next request.
Yeah, so we really wanted to use pagination, but since infinite scrolling was in place, where if you scroll in the future or in the past, the time frame changes, and then we basically inserted or removed irrelevant epics from the timeline depending on what direction user scrolls in horizontally. That kind of prevented us from using pagination, because then things would look out of order, because there is this also sort drop down in place within the filtering area, where user might have selected to sort epics within the roadmap by either start date or a due date. So that was the reason why pagination could not be used. But like we discussed, if we not have horizontal scrolling at all, and we make the entire rendering opinionated, then obviously we can use pagination where, yeah, depending on whether we want to sort by start or due dates or not. Because if user is selected to sort by due date, and then if user sees only 20 epics, then they would have to click multiple times for the next button to see the data for next couple of pages.
Yeah, I think that if we could do this, it would by far help most with the performance. Because even if we would improve front-end side of rendering epics, we are still talking about 12 seconds on backend side for loading all of these epics. Yeah.
And I think I said that problem here is I need more coffee, y'all. The problem to solve here is more about, I think, like the filtering aspect, or just like not letting users get into the state where there's just like a million epics that aren't relevant to them within the roadmap, and then they're having to paginate through them. So if we could solve that problem, it may not be such an issue with the vertical scrolling, but that would just be my assumption. And I'm sure we still could get into a state with a lot of epics that the user cares about within Vue, but maybe we could also be more opinionated about like, you can't use the roadmap unless you first add like a group filter or like some, you know, like there's, or saved filter, or I think that might be a good problem to solve first as well. So I don't know, and keep thinking. Gabe is typing. What do y'all think? Looks like we have some save filter discussions going on. And also I think like, you know, just the experience of entering a roadmap, I think Kristen and I were talking about this, like, can you instead go to maybe like a dashboard and, you know, before you enter the roadmap state, you're building out your roadmap, kind of like a board, right? And, or maybe better than that experience as well, because we have issues there, but really paring it down before you get into that view, making sure you're only going to see what you care about once you enter the roadmap. I think Kristen, you were talking, sorry.
No, I wasn't. I was just trying to catch up in the agenda now that it's moving here. I'm not sure if Gabe, did you mention your performance question just around saving the dates in terms of performance?
Nope, I was waiting for my turn.
Okay.
Whatever.
Okay.
But that was just one thing I was going to bring up is like, have we considered also like storing the inherited date ranges on epics themselves instead of like querying that and all the children? Basically, at when we want to render the roadmaps, we more or less just like if a child changes, then it triggers an update to the parent, basically to calculate that date and then store it on the database in the backend. So when we're querying stuff, like it comes straight out without having to calculate it all on the fly. Just curious if that's feasible or not, or would help at all.
Kushal, what do you think? Anyone?
Yeah,
What do y'all think?
so like I mentioned already, that one of the reason why front end itself is slower is because there are a lot of things that we are trying to do. Another example that I noticed there is, for instance, if any epic has no start or due date defined, and if it has weights present, then when you horizontally scroll, the timeline bar remains affixed within the view. And the implementation logic for that particular behavior is really heavy. And like Jan mentioned, that if we could leverage pagination as well as fixed columns instead of having to scroll horizontally, then it would allow us to immediately see performance gains, because then we don't have to worry about dynamically inserting or removing items from the list. At the same time, all the additional logic that is currently going on, like what to do when user scrolls past the edge, will be gone. There is a lot of code removal that we are looking at if we go forward with the zooming in behavior.
So that has been considered, though, that we would save them, essentially save the date range as if it were in like a spreadsheet, like a start date and an end date. That's all you're looking at versus having to do the math every time.
Yes.
Okay.
Do you know, Jan, the answer to that? So what we initially tried to solve with this is to reduce that at least 11-second load time of epics on GitLab org. Like that's the primary thing we tried to solve. And this was initially seen as kind of the first iteration to get us there in limiting the amount of epics we're actually loading by restricting it by date. So I think we still need to solve that problem. So if we don't want to have dates, we need to, Alexis, like you said, either enforce filtering by group, though that solves our issue, our use case. I don't know if it solves other use cases that don't maybe use groups that have a lot of epics like we do.
Yeah, just be more enforced filtering in general, but that's just one option.
Yes, I mean, I agree that both shrinking the time frame and also introducing filters, both approaches will help for sure with the performance on backend side, because we assume that we will request less epics. Currently, when we do the request, we fetch 2,000 of epics, and we do need to do complex queries for this. So if the idea is okay, in the time frame we will have less epics with the filters, then yes, it will help with the performance. But if the time frame will be still relatively big, and I mean, if you are watching for a time frame which contains still quite many epics, like hundreds or thousands, it will still be slow because you will still be requesting many epics.
Have we done a investigation in where the, because yeah, I mean 3,000 epics are a lot, but I feel like 11 seconds to query 3,000 maybe, like it's still
That's a good
long.
question. When I was checking a month ago, well, the good news is that now it's only 12 seconds, because before it was timing out on the SQL query. This SQL query is now relatively fast. It takes around 3 or 4 seconds to get these epics. But then there is also extra time to fetch milestones, which are fetched because of doing multiplex GraphQL query. But anyway, another portion of time, I think another 6 seconds, is done outside of the SQL queries somewhere in the code. I'm not exactly sure where. It would require some profiler on gitlab.com to investigate this further. But yeah, that's a good point. I think it's worth to investigate further where another seconds are lost. But again, it might be even because of rendering or preparing or processing these thousands of epics for providing them to the front end. So for this reason, I think that if we would be able to just fetch, give me these 10 epics which are actually displayed, it would dramatically simplify or make it more performant.
Yeah, I still think we
think
want to figure out our first iteration here, like what we should force filtering of as just as an MVC. If it's not going to be the dates, we should figure out something, and then we can do some of these side things. And Alexander, your comment, it looks like the inherited dates are already stored on the epic, so that's probably like that. May not be where the time is, but I mean, we should definitely do that investigation, but we still want to figure out what the MVC to get the roadmap loading in quicker than 12 to 15 seconds for GitLab board.
I like the
Safe
idea
filters.
of setting the filters high up, like Alexis was mentioning, like when you set up a board. So you kind of set that just one time essentially into the filter. I'm not so into pagination because I haven't really seen that on other road mapping tools. I don't think that it gives you the freedom, but zooming and anything else that we could do to bring it in.
Yeah, I think that filtering might be a great first step, because it will reduce the amount of epics, and we can see how much it helps with the performance.
So you're saying,
like we have,
Okay.
Yeah,
sorry, are we saying then we want to require a some filter before we render the roadmap part of it, like initially, until we get safe filters?
sounds like it's, yeah, like thinking through the onboarding into a roadmap. Like, what is that step before you enter a roadmap? What is kind of like the creation flow? So like think about it less of like, I want to view every item in GitLab or in my group, and more about like, I'm going to build my roadmap first, and then I'm going to view it, if that makes sense. So then scoping that back, we'll have to think about what the MVC of that is, but we could do that async if that's helpful.
Yeah, because I mean, there is probably a use case, maybe in other organizations, for that top level view. I just don't know with 3,000 and not being able to see them all on a single screen without scrolling both ways. There's a whole lot of value, but as like a board level or C-level executive, there may be value there in seeing that top level everything view.
I think that's where the zooming in could be helpful, right? Like if we at least get it, like if you change the interaction where the viewport is, maybe you're not scrolling horizontally at least, like that could be a start to help with that. And then you're like zooming into the data instead of just seeing everything in those fixed columns. And so we could think about that more too. And so basically circling back to everything else everyone else has said this entire meeting, but yeah.
This is also just epics. Soon we'll have issues on the board, so that will also magnify about, could be 10 issues per epic. So we do have to think about this. It's going to get a lot bigger. I have seen on previous team, we had 30,000 rows we had to render. We used collapsing and bought a grid component that was really lightweight that helped us do that and have like, just, it was working out of the box because it was such a hard problem to solve to have that many. But yeah, we got to start thinking how lean can we get it? I know we're all thinking that, but like the more objects we start rendering on roadmaps, it's going to get heavier as we go.
Another option how to improve the performance might be loading just the top level epics and just load child epics or child issues automatically in a separate next request. I don't mean when user drops down the epic, but just separate request once the loading of top level epics would be done.
You could also, with that, instead of loading them all, what is it like? It's like optimized fetching or whatever, where you basically put the fetch on the mouse over event instead of the click event or the hover event in that area. And usually like that, and then you would just be making such a small request for just that children that generally like the response would be pretty fast. So you could look at that too.
Yeah, right now in the roadmap, relationship between child epics and parent epics is built after the data is loaded. So like the entire tree composition happens before the roadmap gets rendered. So if we can avoid that computation, then we definitely should. Instead, when the node gets expanded, that's when we fetch in the child data. We are already doing it in groups dashboard where we show tree of all the groups, but we fetch child groups for a given group only when the node is expanded. And that is fairly fast. So I think if we want to avoid making a subsequent request right away once the page is loaded, we can avoid it and wait for user to either do mouse over or click. I would go for a click instead of mouse over because if user is just hovering over the timeline bars, we don't want to end up throwing a bunch of requests. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. That's good discussion. I know we're close to time here, so I don't want to cut it off early, but I want to make sure we get in by 9:30. Okay, I'm going to jump in quick. I have 2 items that will be really fast just to go through. I'm suggesting that we add a design demo portion to the start of this meeting. I already added it up in the template, which I just put number 3, design team previews. The goal of that would be that we're hearing from design the work that will be broken down in planning breakdown. So there could be some discussion ahead of time in real time. And have like a mini kickoff of some of those features from the design team. Does that make sense to everyone?
I think it's great.
Okay, and then the second, this is just something I learned when I was CEO Shadow, were some of these skills around meetings. And if I actually encourage all of you to sign up for that, there's a lot of open spots right now. In terms of just encouraging participation as a team, there's just a few things we can do. And these are like 80-20 rules. It's not a hard, fast thing, but if you do it most of the time, meetings will get a lot more inclusive. So when you're if you have a point to raise, you can just indent and put your name and type your point. And then it's up to everyone else to also be just sort of referencing that and asking the person to speak next. So we kind of retain a little bit of order. Also, take notes for your colleagues. So like if someone's in the middle of a thought and they're thinking it through, you can try your best to take notes down as they're going. And then a really other cool tip is the space enter technique for adding new bullets at the bottom. You'll know, like if you just hit enter, sometimes it doesn't work, but if you go space enter a bunch of times, you can add space. And so it's good for inclusivity to give more space below you so that people feel they can just type their response to it and not have to work too hard or it's that cursor dance trying to get between yours and theirs. So yeah, just thought I'd just bring that up so we can all think about that and try to have more people speaking up on these calls.
Cool.
Thanks for the reminder. Those are good tips.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'll speak up.
Sorry, Alexis, you didn't get to leave early and prepare for your showcase. So
Oh
good
no,
luck.
It's going to be a real weird one. It's fine. I'll do a 30-minute prep. We'll see what happens. Anyway, it's good seeing y'all. Thanks for all the feedback.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Enjoy the rest of your days.